The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is Jennifer Schaus coming to you live from Washington, D.C. today, and thank you for joining us in our Webinar Wednesday series as we cover the DFARS. Today is December 8th, and we are at the final session of the DFARS webinars section or part 53, covering forms. And so for those that have been with us since the beginning of the year, we thank you for joining us in this series. Obviously, it was a complimentary series, and all of our webinars are recorded. They're posted both on our website and the YouTube channel, which now has close to 500 complimentary government contracting webinars. If you're looking just for the PowerPoint, you can hop over to slideshare.net and you can log in to SlideShare using your LinkedIn credentials. Most of our attorneys are subject matter experts and usually end up being, I'd say 90% are attorneys and other consultants and accountants. A little bit about us. We do provide professional services for government contractors, primarily focused on helping companies with GSA schedules. We also conduct market analysis and pipeline reports to let companies know what opportunities are coming up in their industry. Contact information of folks within the government or potential teaming partners. Some of our other services are also listed here on this slide. Contact information at the bottom of your screen. And now we're going to run through a thank you to all of our sponsors who make this series and other series possible. First and foremost is the Virginia PTAC. That's the Virginia Procurement Technical Assistance Center. They are co-located out of the George Mason University over in Fairfax. They cover the entire state of Virginia and help companies, aspiring government contractors or small business government contractors with mentoring, training. They've got a variety of classes, most of which I think are online. I think they may have gone into some in person. If you jump onto their website, you can look at their calendar and look at some of the course offerings that they provide. They're a great group, and I highly encourage any government contractor to reach out to them for additional assistance. We also want to thank our friends over at C3. They're a IT provider helping companies with CMMC certification. They've also sponsored many of our webinars and are an advertiser in our newsletter that goes out on Mondays. If you're looking for help with CMMC or trying to stay abreast of what the latest requirements are or are not, you can contact them. The information in the lower right-hand part of your screen. WorkPlan is a software platform that helps government contractors with anything from project management to DCAA compliance and project cost accounting. Your point of contact there is Anita, and her information is in your lower right-hand screen. They also advertise in our newsletter and have sponsored some of our webinars. So we want to thank WorkPlan for their assistance. The Federal Business Council, well-known industry or well-known entity in the government contracting sector. They've got a ton of events that they have done over the years. Most notable is the procurement fair over at the Washington Convention Center. Because of COVID, obviously, a lot of their events are now virtual. If you're looking for a point of contact there, you can reach out to David Powell. His information is in the lower center of your screen. Government white papers sprung out of GovEvents, and this is an online platform where you can post content about government contracting. The government also has some information there, I believe, as well. Donna Monday is your point of contact, and her information is in the top right-hand portion of your screen. So thanks again to White Papers, Gov White Papers, for their sponsorship. Our friends over at SwiftTech are also providing assistance with CMMC. They were early adopters of the CMMC program and are a registered provider organization, and they also have two of their own registered practitioners designated by the CMMC accreditation body. Eric Clark's your point of contact. You can easily see his information in the top right-hand portion of your screen. Ocean 5, they help government contractors and really any business with website design, SEO, messaging, all of your kind of marketing communication, and collateral can be obtained by working with these guys. Chris Brinker is a great person. They're a great organization to work with, and her contact information, Chris, is there at the lower right-hand portion of your screen. Okay, that brings us now to our speaker, Howard Roth, who has kind of stepped in here last minute to help us with this portion of the DFARS. So Howard, I'm going to stop talking and turn the floor over to you as you cover the final part here on DFARS Part 253 forms.
Well, good morning, everybody, or good afternoon. I'm on the West Coast. DFARS Part 253, the very exciting area of forms. Next slide, please. Well, the Defense Acquisition Regulations Part 253 concerning forms is one of the shortest that you're going to find in the DFARS, and it's over the last 20 years really gotten shorter and shorter. In some ways, the shortening has done a disservice to government contractors, because this section is about the forms that are specific to the Department of Defense that you as a contractor would be interested in. And it used to be that there would be an illustration of the forms, pictures of them, explaining the forms, page after page. That is no longer in the DFARS. Basically, when you go into forms at the end, as we'll talk about in a minute, you're just shunted off to a website that has every imaginable Department of Defense form. With of those hundreds of forms, 95% are not germane to government contracts. Fortunately, there are websites out there that live on, and the Department of Defense has kept their old DFARS Part 253 on the web, and I've given you that website. And if you click on there, you will find the older version that did have an illustration of forms. So this is all part of the, we don't need libraries, everything will be online. There is something to be said, though, for some of the content that that was in the books that we used to have, and it becomes easy just to say, well, see a website, and here it's made it a little bit more difficult for you. I hope that the fact that I have this historical website that you can go to will be of help if you're dealing with a consideration of the forms that your business, or if you're with the government, that you're utilizing. Next slide, please. So this is really it. This is the entire DFARS 253, and if you want to boil it down, it's really only two forms. I mean, the Department of Defense has really decided that they're only going to talk about two forms in particular that are agency forms, as a part of this section where they could talk about any form they wanted. And those two forms are DD Form 1155, which is your form that's used to order supplies or services. It's a fairly common form that I think anybody in government contracts has seen. And the important point is that all the standard forms, and standard forms like GSA publishes them, or other parts of the government, the Department of Defense doesn't use those standard forms that you might see in government contracting with other agencies. Rather, they use the DD Form 1155, and that's a one-page form, and it's easily found on this website that has 10,000 forms. But again, and I have a citation to that later in the presentation. But the point is that there aren't a listing of forms like there used to be that are specific to government contracts in the actual DFARS, other than the DD Form 1155, and the other form that is considered in this subpart 253 is DD Form 1547. Now, DD Form 1547 is a record of weighted guidelines applications. Basically, this is what the government uses when it's doing a profit or fee analysis. And that's why you see it falls under 253.215, contracting by negotiation. And the form that is important enough that they've kept in here is this record of weighted guidelines application. And in essence, it's a form that considers a number of different areas and has normally we would weight the difficulty of a project at 5, and if you're on a scale of 1 to 10, if you're a 10, then you're going to be able to argue for more profit, and if you're below the 5 and you're a 1 or a 2, then which is where you don't want to be, of course, then the government is going to try to argue for less profit. So those are the two Department of Defense forms that are important enough for this part to provide additional guidance on. Now, there is one other form. It's not an agency form. It's called an SF 1403. And that is under contractor qualifications, where you see the 253.209-1, responsible prospective contractors. That's the pre-award survey is what it's called. But again, it's not an agency, it's not a Department of Defense form. It is a form, though, that they consider important enough to provide guidance on here in the DFARS. That is subpart 253.2, which is the prescription of forms. In other words, those are the prescribed forms, and what we're really talking about are 3 forms, 2 of which are agency forms, and 1 of which is an SF form, which is actually put out by GSA. Then the next part is the illustration of forms, and specific to that are the agency forms. Now, when you actually go to click on the 253.303, you don't get a listing of forms. You get a website that, like I said, has every DoD form. So it's really not that that helpful, in the scheme of things. You might ask yourself, well, Howard, what have they cut out? Well, they used to include the MIPR form 448. Which is used, within the government to transfer money and supplies and services. They also used to have the contract data requirements list, which is the form 1423. They've taken those 2 forms out of any kind of detailed description. Those remain agency forms. It's just that they're no longer listed. I mean, you've got to really know that you're looking for that, because you're not going to find it in the DFAR, since the DFAR doesn't list the government contracts forms anymore. So a pretty compact table of contents here. Next slide, please. So the first form, as we discussed, is the DD Form 1155, and basically that's used instead of the other government forms that you might see with a non DoD agency, and it simply says to follow the procedures of the PGI 253 213F for the use of forms. Now, if you follow those procedures, you really don't see much when you go there. I mean, it basically just says go to 253 213-70, and on that you will find for the DD Form 1155 just a series of instructions. Next slide, please. A series of instructions that tells you, your basic information, such as the, name of the contractor and where things are shipped to, the schedule of supplies or services, and then the voucher number, and who's going to pay you. So it's a fairly simple form. I would just say, based on my practice, you find out right away whether it's got a listing on there. Is it a small or small disadvantaged or women-owned business? And of course, it's important. It identifies the schedule of supplies or services to make sure that everyone's on the same page as far as what's being ordered. You could say, in the scheme of things, though, that the Form 1155 is a fairly simple form. The other form isn't really as simple, and it falls under the contracting by negotiation, and it's your DD Form 1547, the record of weighted guidelines application. And again, it says to follow the procedures in the PGI, and essentially if you go there, it has instructions just like the DD Form that we just talked about for ordering supplies, has the instructions for the 1547. The 1547 is a much more complicated form, again, because it's dealing with this whole idea of trying to figure out the amount of profit that should be provided based on essentially the type of contract, whether it's everything from a fixed price to a cost plus incentive fee, the type of effort, manufacturing, services, construction, and it has certain approaches that are fairly complex. And what I would say is, if you're not going to, by going to the instructions that you find in the PGI at 253 215-70, really going to be able to understand the form. While it's not in the DFARS, what I would suggest that you do is you go to the Department of Defense Contract Pricing Finance Guide, Volume 3, Chapter 11. And that guide has a good, 15 pages that explains, how to understand this DD Form 1547 weighted guidelines. And I mean, if you're a company, the whole purpose of understanding the weighted guidelines is to make sure that you get the most profit that you can when you're doing this this negotiation. I would point out that while the weighted guidelines are used, specifically for contract changes under the changes clause, that there are other situations, like in a termination for convenience, in which the government sometimes tries to say, let's use the weighted guidelines. And what you should do instead, of course, is to generally use your cost to complete, especially if it's going to be a higher profit percentage when you're dealing with the government. And in fact, FAR Part 49 tells the government that they should look at the cost to complete. And there's a form, it's a standard form 1439 that talks about profit in that situation. But that standard form is not a Department of Defense form 1439, and it's not included in this section of the DFARS dealing with forms. Next slide, please. So here we come now to the illustration of forms. Now, I sound like an old person. I guess I am to a certain extent, but it used to be that on the illustration of forms, they would actually have illustrations, like when you look at an illustration in a book, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It would have a picture of the form, and it would provide you with information and guidance on that form. Well, that no longer exists. And when you're in the DFARS, what you see there as far as forms are available at, you click onto that website, which is from the White House or the Washington headquarters services. That's why it says whs.mil directives forms. And when you get onto that website, you'll see that list of DD forms, 1 through 499, and then all the way down to 3,000 through 3,499. And the thing about it is there are hundreds and hundreds of forms there. So it's directing you there, but almost none of them are forms that deal with government contracts. As we just discussed, there's only 2 DD forms that are discussed in particular in this entire part, and that is the 1155, which we talked about, which is for the ordering of supplies, and then the DD form 1447 dealing with figuring out profit under the weighted guidelines. So what they're basically telling you is, happy hunting. So again, I find it helpful, at least to me, to go back to, I have a book, but if you don't have a book, to this dead DOD website, which I have there, which has the historical illustration of forms, and it lists the traditional government contracts forms that are important to government contractors. Now, because it's a historical list, some of those forms have gone away, but at least it helps you to when you're starting to dive into those hundreds of DD forms that they cite to you. Now, what an ISO 9000 or somebody who's just really into efficiency within the government would probably say is, well, Howard, if you're dealing with the DFARS, you wouldn't be looking for a form unless your DFARS clause that you were looking to cited to that form, so you would already know the form that you're looking for. And I mean, that is probably the point that they would make. However, I find that that's not always the case, that I don't, sometimes I'm just referred to, a specific area. And in the old days, it was nice to go and look, well, what forms does the Department of Defense have, for instance, concerning reporting patents and rights and technical data. If you go to the historical list, you'll be able to find, that particular form. If you were to ask me what forms, are important, well, again, as I mentioned at the outset, there are a number of forms related to the contract data requirements list. In other words, things that you're going to provide as a part of, as deliverables under the contract. And that used to be in this DFARS Part 253. There was a section that went into great detail about those forms, and of course they cut that out. So now if you want to begin your journey into learning about the CDRL requirements list, you would go to DD Form 1423. It's not listed in the DFARS, but I'll tell you, you will find it in those DD forms from 1000 to 1499. And then if you go there, you can sort of fish around for the other CDRL forms. And again, what I do is I go to the historical listing, and I use that to try to find where the new forms under this list of DD forms, are found. I guess what I would take away from this scintillating area of forms is forms are key. The government will do what's in a form. And so you have to understand your forms such that you can maximize what the government's going to give you. Again, coming back to an area that I know and love, termination for convenience. You have your DD forms for your termination settlement proposal based on the inventory and total cost. Now, those are not agency forms. Those are not Department of Defense forms, so they're not under this subpart 253. However, they're key forms to understand, and they're published by GSA. And the key thing to do is to go and to understand the directions and what they're asking for, such that you can maximize the amount of money that you're going to get under a termination settlement proposal. Now here in the Department of Defense, there's really only one form where that they talk about in great detail, and that's the record of weighted guidelines application, your DD Form 1447, and that's when you're negotiating profit, and you really want to understand that form well. Well, the DFARS isn't going to give you that much help, as I pointed out, and so you'd go to that contract pricing finance guide, that volume 3 of that chapter 11. I commend it to you. If you're trying to get more money out of the government and you're referring them back to their own form or the directions to their form, you're going to be successful, because the government likes to do things, and I mean this in all due respect, the government likes to do things in a transparent manner. And so if the guidance tells them they can do it, then they'll do it. When you're trying to make a new argument without a form or without detailed directions on the form, it's much more difficult. Next slide, please. So I was thinking about forms, and I said, well, this is a pretty slim area for folks, Howard. Maybe there are some cases out there we can talk about. So I searched in our databases that we all have, and You know, there's two, really, there's only two, there's two places that you would find forms or this subpart 253 litigated. You know, one would be claims, which would be, you know, at the Court of Federal Claims or at the agency boards, and the other would be protests. And, you know, there really are just two that deal with, you know, actually talking about this part 253. And in the one, you know, the court in this nascent group joint venture by Native American Services Corporation against the U.S., the Court of Federal Claims, you know, declined to find that no meeting of the minds occurred simply because the government had used an expired version of the DD Form 1155. I mean, they basically had argued you didn't use the right form, so we didn't have a meeting of the minds. As we discussed, that's a pretty simple form. You know, the name of the contractor, the name of the government, you know, both parties sign it. And so the court didn't have a difficulty in finding that it was, you know, a pro forma approval of a formal document. And so that a contract was formed, even though it wasn't the most up-to-date form. You know, the other was, of course, if you do bid protests, you're also going to be at the Court of Federal Claims or the GAO, or of course you can file an agency protest. You know, just to plug for agency protests, you know, as long as you do it quickly and you don't mess up on your automatic stay, I often find that, especially for pre-award, that agency protests can be quite effective and are not that expensive in comparison to GAO, which will be more expensive, and the Court of Federal Claims, which will be even more expensive. But here we did have, I did find a protest that dealt with Part 253, and it dealt with the Contract Data Requirements List, the CDRL form. And we talked about the fact that this used to be an important enough form that it was discussed in depth in Part 253. It's no longer the case. I still think it's a pretty important form, and it's 1423. So, you know, I would commend going to that laundry list of DD forms now, and you can, you know, that's one that's important, 1423. There are related CDRL forms that are around 1423 in that list that you can also look at. But GAO, again, shot down the contractor's argument that, you know, the failure to submit the pricing for the data items on the CDRL didn't affect the acceptability of price and the government's rights under the contract. Basically finding the CDRL pricing data, it wasn't a part of the contract because the cost of the data items is included in the contract line item prices, so that it was always in there. You know, I just thought it would be worthwhile to see, you know, has it come up as an issue, and you know, the resounding, you know, has this part, and the resounding answer is not really. But with that said, forms are really key. And I would say go back to the historical list of forms and run through those forms for your own business and see which ones might be relevant to you, and then see if they still are in the list of forms that are now published. Of course, like I said, if you don't know the number, the purpose of going back to the historical list is you can find the number and then go to the modern list that's updated, and typically what you'll find is either the form is no longer there, which means it doesn't exist, but it sometimes is just a few numbers now higher or lower. It's been renumbered, and then when you click on that, you can look at the directions for that form. There are a lot of key forms out there, especially, and I come back to it in termination for convenience. I mean, you're going to live and die by those forms in bringing together your costs. We're not talking directly about those forms today simply because they're not agency forms. They're not a part of this particular, part of the DFARS. So there you have it. I guess we're last in the series here, and I'm not taking you away from too much of your of your lunch. But remember that there is this part 253 forms, that there are 2 DD forms that are discussed. One, the 1547 on profit, is fairly complex, but is important to understand when you're filling out, and that you should go to the Contract Pricing Finance Guide, Volume 3, Chapter 11, to help you to fill out that form, because you're not going to find the guidance, within the illustration of forms anymore. There also is one standard form dealing with contractor pre-award audits, 1403, that's discussed in this subpart, that has some information that will be helpful to you in understanding the form. And then the final form is just your DD form 1155, straightforward for order or supplies. So there you have it. Short, sweet. I hope you all enjoy your holiday season with family and friends. If you ever have a question about government contracts and want to bounce something off of me, please feel free to call. If you have a question about any forms, please feel free to call. Jennifer, thank you for inviting me, and I've enjoyed chatting about forms.
Great. Thank you so much, Howard, for sharing your time, your expertise, putting these slides together, and just everyone as well, the attendees. We want to thank you for joining us in the series. This rounds out the DFARS. So now we have a semi-full library. 2020, we covered all of the FAR parts. You can find those on our website with the complimentary download. We now have completed the DFARS, and then next year in 2022, we will cover the FAR supplements on Wednesdays, and then on the corresponding Friday will be the playbook. So we'll talk about business opportunities, bidding opportunities, and things that are happening within the department or agency. So again, on Wednesdays, we'll cover the FAR nuances within specific departments and agencies. And then on the corresponding Friday is the playbook series. But again, back to today, Howard, this was a great presentation. Really enjoyed it, and glad that we now have a full library. So thanks for being our bookend here. And thanks again, everyone, for joining us in today's session, as well as any earlier sessions that you may have attended throughout the year. Happy New Year, Merry Christmas, and enjoy your holidays, everybody. Thanks again.
Bye-bye, Jennifer.
Bye-bye.